Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 132 of The Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, we are welcoming friend of the podcast, Dr. Jerrod Brown, back to the program. We love whenever Jerrod joins us in that he is a fountain of information on the topic du jour. And this week, he does not disappoint. If you are a longtime listener to this podcast, you will note that we like to take a holistic approach when it comes to the work that practitioners conduct with justice-involved individuals. That is, should we at least begin with a solid grasp of the risk, need, responsivity framework? Yes. Should we also begin merging our approaches to align with desistance theory? Yes. But we also need to consider other variables which may have affected that client's trajectory. Things such as trauma or adverse childhood experiences, for example. And we should strive to look at other considerations as well. I encourage you to go back and catch some of Dr. Brown's previous interviews to showcase this point. He has done entire episodes on topics ranging from neurodiversity to alexithymia to self-regulation deficits, even the perils of excessive screen time. Well, this week, right on the heels of many of you likely having leftover Halloween candy still laying around the house, Jerrod is here to talk to us about what criminal justice professionals should know about their clients' excessive sugar intake. Dr. Brown is no stranger to the Criminologist podcast, but allow me to give a brief introduction nonetheless. Jerrod Brown, PhD, is a professor, trainer, researcher, and consultant with multiple years of experience teaching collegiate courses. Jerrod is currently an assistant professor, program director, and lead developer for the Master of Arts degree in Human Services with an emphasis in forensic behavioral health and a second emphasis area in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies for Concordia University right here in St. Paul, Minnesota. In addition to the experience mentioned above, Jerrod has provided consultation services to a number of caregivers, professionals, and organizations pertaining to topics related to autism spectrum disorder, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, confabulation, suggestibility, trauma and other life adversities, traumatic brain injury, and youth fire setting. Jerrod has also conducted numerous trainings for professional and student audiences. He is also the founder and chief executive officer for the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies, or AFIS, and he's also editor-in-chief of Forensic Scholars Today. Enjoy my interview with Dr. Jerrod Brown as he discusses the perils of excessive sugar intake and what criminal justice practitioners need to know. And I will see you all on the other side. The show, Jerrod, always a treat when you join us here on the Criminologist podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about excessive sugar consumption, what criminal justice professionals need to know. And I'm already semi-dreading this, Jerrod. I learned so much from your talks, and I reflect on my own life. And I've had a love-hate battle with sugar. Sometimes I've gone cold turkey on sugar for up to a year or more, and then, as was the case with a lot of people, when the pandemic hit and the lockdowns kicked in, all that went out the window. So even from a personal standpoint, I needed to be reminded of this. But also, as I said, from a practical standpoint, there's a lot of things that criminal justice professionals, human service practitioners need to, at a minimum, I would contend, be made aware of. But beyond that, there may even be some practical things that they can do. But why don't you lay the foundation for this, and then as topics pop up, I'll ask some follow-up questions so we can go down those various rabbit holes. But generally speaking, why don't you kick it off talking about the perils of excessive sugar consumption?
You bet, Joe. Thanks for having me back, buddy. And this is a really, really, really important topic that I think most of us can relate to. Who doesn't like sugar? Who probably hasn't consumed a little too much sugar from time to time? And there's plenty of research in the last few years showing that COVID and the stress and the lockdowns, all these things, have amplified highly processed foods, sugars, fast food, and weight gain and sleep issues, all of these things. We'll look at this today through a criminal justice lens, and people are going to be shocked, I think, to hear some of the things I have to say. And what I'm going to share today is not going to be rooted in my personal opinion. It's really going to be rooted in what the research science says. I always want to give a disclaimer when I give talks like this that I am not a licensed nutritionist, but I think I have 3 separate nutrition certifications and several other health and wellness certifications. So I'm only coming at this from an angle of education. No advice here. Talk to a nutritionist before implementing any strategies. This is just basically kind of sharing with your audience what the research has to say. So for today, I'm really going to look at this through a behavioral health lens. So I really want to tackle this through behavioral health. How does sugar impact our behavioral health, which could be mood, our emotions? When we study behavioral health, think of like we're going to study the topics of stress and anxiety and depression and grief and loss issues and addictive tendencies. But with behavioral health too, I spend a lot of time studying sleep and screen time addiction, our drinking habits. And when I say drinking habits, I'm not necessarily talking about alcohol per se. I'm talking about sugar-sweetened beverage consumption, energy drinks, or the lack thereof. What about chronic low-grade dehydration? There is a lot of research literature on how chronic low-grade dehydration can have a real negative impact on brain health, behavioral health, and our physical health. So I'm really looking at it through that lens. And when we think of excessive sugar consumption, and I'm really going to focus on processed sugars today, it's not really good to be talking too much about like natural sugars from fruits. This is more processed sugars, sugar-sweetened beverages, fast food addiction, those kind of things. It's important to consider that excessive sugar consumption is a threat to emotional health. There's so much research to support that. There are many, many threats to emotional health that we're all aware of. Obviously, trauma and not getting good sleep and dealing with loneliness and high levels of irritability and rumination and executive functioning impairments. And we've talked somewhat about alexithymia here and there. That's a huge threat to emotional health. Lack of exercise is a threat. Unresolved conflict, living near a factory or some environmental pollution. There's plenty of research on that. Those are all threats to emotional health. There's many more, but sugar is one of them I would put under that umbrella. And when we think of this in the era of COVID-19 and beyond, anecdotally, I've talked to many, many people. I have consulted on many cases where the individual is clearly using excessive amounts of sugar. Why might that be the case? Just things I've heard anecdotally or cases I've consulted on. Again, worry, fear, uncertainty. Are there any kind of other addictive tendencies going on where they're abusing caffeine or tobacco or drugs or alcohol? There's a connection between eating really unhealthy and having maybe more cravings for sugar or consuming like sugar sweetened beverages and screen time. So there's some studies that have looked at excessive screen time exposure, maybe an amplifier for eating things that aren't good for us because maybe we're stressed out. Maybe we're living a sedentary lifestyle. We'll talk about all of those things today. When you think about the basics of sugar, now sugar, I mean, depending on the kind of sugar we're talking about, there's many kinds of different sugars, glucose, fructose, being aware of the biochemistry aspects of this. So disaccharides, monosaccharides. Your audience doesn't need to know those terms for today. If we go deeper in the weeds, we can get into all of that stuff. But most added sugars in our diets come from processed foods, processed kinds of prepared foods. And most of it comes from sugar-sweetened beverages or desserts or snacks like ice cream and cookies and brownies and pastries and pies. When I'm talking about added sugars, it's more the process. It's going to a fast food joint. Just having a hamburger at a fast food joint. There's sugar in the buns. There's sugar in so many things. Sugar in ketchup, sugar in barbecue sauce. The list goes on. So there's a lot of added sugars out there that people don't even realize. Breakfast cereals, a lot of times, depending on the kind, are loaded with added sugars. Yogurts, a lot of yogurts are just loaded with added sugars. So again, I'm not giving any nutritional advice here, but just kind of giving some basics. So added sugars, sugar-sweetened beverages are everything I know about the topic and what the research says is probably the number one source of added sugar in the American diet. So think of it as a liquid carbohydrate. I mean, if you're drinking sodas all day long, or even fruit juices, lots of sugar in fruit juices. What happens if someone loves milk and it's chocolate milk? Ton of sugar in chocolate milk. Ketchup, who doesn't love ketchup? Or other kinds of different sauces. There's a lot of sugar added to these things. Sports drinks. I know there's one article that talks about how sports drinks are marketed for athletes and helping with athletic performance, but the research found that most people who consume sports drinks are not athletes. Just take that into account too. I think it's important too that some canned soups, energy drinks, all of these things have added sugar in it. So very important to understand the importance of learning how to read labels and just maybe consulting with a nutritionist, just being aware of these things, having greater awareness can be a very helpful thing. Joe, before I get into is sugar addiction a real thing, I want any thoughts, questions on kind of just some basics so far.
Maybe just a clarification or an elaboration for the listener. Jerrod, I think most folks are aware of the distinction between physical health and mental health, but you also referenced earlier behavioral health and emotional health. Is there a difference in the granularity of those definitions, or what's an example of what each of those may or may not look like?
They get tricky, a lot of overlap. So I personally, if looking through my lens, behavioral health encompasses all of it, in my opinion. It includes sleep habits, eating habits, exercise habits or screen habits, depression, anxiety, grief and loss issues. If you just look at mental health, sometimes depending on the study you look at, we're just focusing on like anxiety and depression and those kind of things. Emotional health and behavioral health are sometimes used interchangeably. When I think of behavior, how does what we do impact our behavior? It could be our body mannerisms, our physiological regulation internally that maybe a lot of people can't see, but the person's dealing with a lot of internal distress. When we're thinking about emotions, how does someone articulate their emotions? How do they regulate their emotions? Emotional dysregulation, you want to study that. Irritability, rumination, lack of emotional self-control, emotional lability. If you've ever had a client, if they're dealing with emotional lability, they could come into your office, happy, laughing 1 minute, crying, yelling, screaming the next. It's a roller coaster ride of emotions. But there's more similarities between those than differences. Did that make things even more murky? Be honest, Joe. Kind of.
It did and did not. Let's proceed, though. I'm getting a handle on it. It's really all about, and that's one of the themes of this program, a holistic approach and not getting so pigeonholed on one lens that you're losing sight of the forest from the trees.
Absolutely. So depending on who you talk to and what article you look at, is sugar addiction a real thing? Some articles say yes. More and more articles over the years are saying at least there's a habit-forming nature of sugar. Is it a full-blown addiction like cocaine or methamphetamines? Animal studies have been done on this, human studies. I am in the camp that it is addictive. I believe that. Some people would disagree, but I hope there's no disagreement that it is at least habit forming in some level. I'll give you an example of that. My wife and I cut out sugar a long time ago, and we tried it, and I clearly went through some sort of withdrawal. I was more irritable. I didn't sleep well the first few nights. I went through some sort of withdrawal in my body from not having a lot of sugar. So I've heard this over and over again from people. I know lots of people that, at least on the surface, appear that they are absolutely addicted to sugar. I've worked with a lot of clients in cases where there's been habit-forming behaviors around this, and it has wreaked havoc on their brain and body. If we look at sugar through an addiction lens, just looking at it through other kinds of substance uses, is there a strong craving to have sugar? Thinking of the cravings. Can someone go without sugar for a long period of time? And when I'm talking about sugar, again, like sugar-sweetened beverages, snacks, cakes, those kind of things, what kind of cravings do they have? If they stop, do they have some sort of withdrawal symptom? Do they have physiological dysregulation? Are they more irritable? Do they just feel amped up? So looking at that, I think thinking of this too through a tolerance lens. Over a period of time, are people consuming more and more and more sugar because they need more and more sugar to get rid of anxiety? I hear this a lot in cases I've consulted on where they have a lot of sugar because it seems to calm their body down. But after 20 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, whatever it is, that anxiety comes rushing back. So now they need more and more sugar to have that same effect in the past. So thinking of a tolerance, thinking of the reward system in our brain too. If you look at neuroscience research, having a lot of sugar, it lights up parts of the brain that are very similar to some drugs. So looking at the neuroscience aspects of this, very fascinating. I've worked with many people that have had addictive tendencies over the years. Almost all of these clients have said to me, after they have stopped using alcohol, and if they're in some sort of treatment program or halfway house, they're snacking on sugar. They crave the sweets. They're pounding down the pop. I'm very hesitant to say this. I'm going to say it, but if you're working in a drug and alcohol treatment program, I think it would be very beneficial for you to consult with a nutritionist, because there is some literature to support the fact if you can help people learn how to regulate their blood sugars more effectively, that actually may help them stay sober longer and improve their mental health. Because sometimes when we have blood sugar crashes or we spike our insulin and glucose levels too high, that could be a factor in relapse on alcohol or drugs in some cases. So consulting with a nutritionist if you are in those kind of settings. Think of this too, Joe. you go deep into the weeds when we think of sugar and these processed foods. There's a whole line of literature that talks about ultra processed foods. These are going to be foods that contain little to no nutritional value, and they're usually processed. They are loaded with added colorings, flavors, emulsifiers, different thickeners, those kind of things. And typically, ultra-processed foods have low nutrients, but they have high energy density. And they might have higher content of saturated fats and trans fats and added sugars. And a lot of times, ultra-processed foods have limited fiber in it, and potassium and zinc and magnesium and vitamins A and B and D and E, and the list goes on and on and on. So you want to be aware of ultra-processed foods. There is a whole line of literature, Joe, too, that talks about food addiction. Now, is food addiction a real thing? Well, it sure seems like it to me. Food addictions, people might have higher intakes of, again, sugar-sweetened beverages. Maybe it's French fries. Maybe it's fast food. Maybe it's ice cream. Maybe it's lots of chocolate. So looking at this kind of literature is very important. And when I'm talking about these things, I think it's imperative for your audience to at least understand the topic of the Western diet. There is so much literature that talks about the Western diet. Now, if you haven't heard of the Western diet, think of it as highly processed foods, added salts, added sugars, lower intakes of fresh fruits and vegetables and whole grains and nuts and so on. The Western diet is pretty much every fast food joint in America, and going to restaurants where they come out with these huge servings of breads and things that are just loaded with processed things and huge basket of fries. That's basically the Western diet. And if people really consume only a Western diet, the research is pretty clear on this. It leads to more poor health outcomes. It's been linked to having more digestive health issues, more sleep problems, more problems with chronic inflammation. It's been studied within the context of having more allergies, autoimmune disorders, metabolic syndrome, depression. The list goes on and on and on. So, Joe, before I jump into sugar-sweetened beverages and some of the forensic and criminal justice aspects of this, any other clarifying thoughts or questions I can answer?
No, Jerrod, it sounds like you're going to go there. I was just going to ask for a link, as you just alluded to those criminal justice tie-ins and that aspect of this chat. So proceed, good sir.
You bet. I mean, again, what we're talking about is a huge topic. I mean, these are hundreds of hours of training content that we're going to be covering here in the next few minutes. So if any of you work with women who are pregnant and looking at this through a prenatal lens, there's actually been several studies that have looked at prenatal exposure to sugar-sweetened beverages. And some of the research indicates that women who consume large amounts of sugar-sweetened beverages during pregnancy, that could be a factor in possible negative health outcomes for that developing child in utero. I think it's also important to take into account when we're looking at some of the consequences associated with high levels of sugar exposure. I'm not talking just a small amount, but excessive amounts of sugar. It's been studied, obviously, within the context of many physical health problems, again, obesity, type 2 diabetes. It's been looked at within the context of cardiovascular disease. But it's also been looked at what impact does it have on the brain. So it may have a negative impact on behavioral functioning, self-regulation of food intake. It may negatively impact some cognitive functioning capacities. So we've talked about those kind of things in previous episodes. Sugar intake, excessive amounts, may also have a negative impact on the HPA axis. A couple studies have actually looked at that. High amounts of sugar consumption may negatively impact the HPA axis. And if your audience is new to listening to me talk, The HPA axis is the hypothalamus, pituitary adrenal axis. It's our main stress response system in our body. It's a hormone regulator. So it's part of our endocrine system. Why do you care about that? Because if our hormones are off, we're probably not sleeping well. It can impact our mood. It can impact our energy, all of those things. So very, very important topic. This has also been looked at within the context of oxidative stress. So high amounts of sugar may contribute to more oxidative stress in our bodies. Oxidative stress, basically think of it as it's not a good thing. It can really increase the aging process for some. It's really an imbalance between oxidants and antioxidants in our body. So oxidative stress over time can negatively impact our biological system and lead to tissue damage and so on. So there's really fascinating research around that, but kind of scary too, obviously. So when we think about this too, there is some evidence, not a lot of studies, but I've seen this anecdotally a lot. People that have had extensive trauma histories may be more prone to eating food that might not be good for them. They might have an overconsumption of processed foods or sugar, and that can contribute to a host of issues for their body. And it can contribute to unstable blood sugar levels, more inflammation. It's actually been shown to maybe increase hyperactivity in some people. There's some controversy with that. Not all studies are consistent on that, but excessive amounts of sugar consumption may be a factor for having more kind of hyperactivity kinds of behavior. I've also mentioned, I think briefly at the beginning, Joe, that excessive amounts of sugar can have a real negative impact on our digestive health. I can't stress enough to learn about digestive health issues because there's a big connection between what happens in our gut and what goes on in the brain. It's that gut-brain health connection. Very important to understand when the gut is off, the brain is off. And if you're working with folks who have had extensive trauma histories, drug and alcohol problems, serious mental health issues, the research really leans to the fact high percentage of those clients already have underlying digestive health issues. If you've ever worked with someone that has dealt with high levels of peer victimization or bullying and teasing, there's a couple articles that have also talked about the very nature of bullying victimization, especially among adolescents, could be a factor in some stress-related eating and maybe skipping meals in the morning, and that could negatively impact blood sugar levels throughout the day. Sleep problems and excessive sugar intake are oftentimes connected. Plenty of studies that look at that, and there's several studies that talk about the importance of helping clients get better sleep, where then it can help improve their emotional health, their behavioral health, and social health. Through a forensic criminal justice lens, there's plenty of studies that look at sleep deprivation among inmates. And what they found is people that are in confinement settings typically have higher levels of sleep problems. Allostatic load is another topic I think your audience should at least be aware of. I talk a lot about that within the context of trauma and adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress. But some research also points to the fact that excessive sugar consumption may exacerbate allostatic load, which is wear and tear in our body. It's kind of a biochemical marker for premature aging. So allostatic load, just think of it as wear and tear in the body. We age more prematurely. We might have more health-related problems. It's called allostatic load. I think when we jump specifically into the forensic side of things, some studies have looked at how excessive consumption of sugar foods may exacerbate externalizing behavioral problems among some people. Externalizing behavioral problems, you as the probation officer, the corrections officer, the police officer, you can see externalizing problems a lot easier. These are things that might be more rooted in clients becoming more irritable, more boisterous, more defensive. These are things outwardly, but you need to be aware of two internalizing problems the person may be dealing with that they can mask more. Internalizing problems are going to be more depression, anxiety, extreme shyness, worry, panic, things of that nature. When we look at some of the, I would say, the neurocriminology literature, and we've done a podcast together on that. If you dig into the neurocriminology literature, that literature talks a lot about the importance of understanding diet and nutrition in relation to criminal behavior. But it's not just that. You know this better than I do, Joe. There's so many factors that we need to take into account when we're looking at why people engage in criminal behavior. Diet is one of them. But what happens if someone had prenatal alcohol exposure, drug exposure, or toxic exposure where they were living in a dilapidated condition and they were exposed to a lot of lead or mercury early on in life, or they lived next to a factory and there was a lot of just exposure to like endocrine disruptors. So we need to be aware of environmental pollutants. When we're talking about nutrition too, maybe someone's having lots and lots of just not good food for them over a long period of time. But what happens if someone has lack of nutrients as well? So mom, pregnant, doesn't have good prenatal care. Maybe there's homelessness, poverty. She doesn't have a lot of food. The lack of vitamins can have a real negative impact. And some of the neurocriminology literature has actually looked at like different vitamin deficiencies. After World War II, in certain countries in Europe, they've done studies and they looked at birth outcomes where they didn't have a lot of food and a lot just malnutrition. Some of those individuals had higher incidence of conduct problems as they got older. When we look at this too through a glucose level, I haven't talked much about that today, but glucose, just being aware of our blood sugar levels in our body has been studied within the context of aggression. There's some studies that have found that blood sugar levels that are very low may be a factor for some people to engage in aggressive kind of impulsive behaviors where blood sugar dips too low, they become more irritable. They have a hard time putting on the brakes. Their self-control is lessened. That has actually been studied within this context. And if we take a deeper dive into low glucose levels in relation to problematic behavior, the very nature of having low glucose levels may impact mood instability. It has been shown to contribute to lower levels of self-control because, interestingly, our brains need glucose to help feed our brains to have better self-control. Fascinating stuff through a biochemistry lens. Low glucose levels have also been linked to having higher levels of irritability. It's been studied within the context of marital aggression, something that we don't think about if you're working in domestic violence settings. Could low glucose levels be one factor of many? Joe, I'm going to stop for a second. I know we're covering a ton of stuff. I have several more things to cover, but I wanted to see if you had any other thoughts.
I wanted to ask you to maybe talk more about, you referenced blood sugar levels and aggression, but then you also started talking about impulsivity and low self-control, which for those of us under the risk-need responsivity framework, when we think of those criminogenic needs, we think about things like impulsivity, low self-control. Is that something that a practitioner would want to take a look at? Is the jury still out on practical steps that could be taken around blood sugar levels to address those variables that I just cited?
To me, in my opinion, it is an absolute no-brainer to understand these topics. Now, a probation officer or a case manager therapist is probably not going to obviously diagnose this, but working with a medical health provider working with a nutritionist. Maybe your client has diabetes or prediabetes. Just learning how to manage our blood sugar levels, working nutritionists to eat healthier. It supports us on a cellular level. It can help us feel better. We sleep better typically, managing our inflammation more effectively. I think it should be a frontline intervention in the criminal justice system. Now, the jury's still out. There are some people that are vocal about that. There are some that maybe just dabble with that. But there are articles, if you go online, you can find plenty of news stories online that talk about this too. There's journal articles that talk about nutritional interventions should be considered with clients in confinement settings. And if we can do this, it may be one means of many. And by no means am I saying you help someone eat better and you address these things from a nutritional lens, that crime is going to go away. But I think it's one piece of the puzzle that oftentimes is not talked about. I have many degrees, and one of my degrees is in criminal justice, and some are in forensics. These topics never, ever came up. But as I dig into the literature, they're out there. This is not stuff that's just I'm throwing out there out of left field. This is supported in the empirical-based literature. And when somebody is dealing with nutritional deficits and they're eating just terribly and they don't get good nutrients, what does this literature say? Over a long period of time, especially if it happened in utero or early in childhood and these things went on for years and years, it can decrease brain cell growth and development. And it has a real negative impact on neurochemistry and neurohormones. So these things can have a real impact on the way we function, our bodies, and overconsumption of sugar may also be a contributing factor in some cases to more compulsive behaviors and higher levels of impulse control. There are studies that have looked at that as well. There is one study I'm aware of that talks about domestic violence. And at least from this particular article, people that were in domestic violence situations were more frequent consumers of sugary snacks and beverages compared to people who weren't. I don't know what connection that has. I'm not saying it has any connection, but you're doing good cog skills work. You're doing all the great things the probation officer or the facilitator's doing. But are we missing something at a biochemical level where that person is dealing with such body dysregulation because they're lacking nutrients? They don't know how to cope with their stress. So in one hand, they're pounding down the coffee all day long. On the other hand, they're pounding down the soda drinks all day long because it helps them feel better, at least in the short term. But then all these emotions come rushing back. Could that be an intervention to consider? If we look at this just within the context of confinement settings, in preparing for our talk today, I had a lot of information to share. I went through the peer-reviewed literature, but I also went online just to see what popular news stories were. And there are a lot of articles online through well-known newspaper outlets and from smaller outlets you may not have known. If you just type in food issues, food insecurity, nutritional deficits within prison systems, there are quite a few articles out there that talk about the importance of really considering this. And even when we're looking at this, be aware of the topic of food insecurity. There is some studies that have looked at how formerly incarcerated individuals, as they leave prison, may be dealing with higher levels of food insecurity because of maybe some economic deprivation where they have a hard time finding a job, keeping a job. They're dealing with higher levels of poverty. So they don't have a lot of money to spend on good food, good quality food. So they're always buying the things that are cheap. What do they buy a lot, at least in my experience? Gas station food, highly processed food, things that are just loaded with things that may not necessarily be good for them. And if you just consider food insecurity literature, take out any criminal justice aspects, people that deal with food insecurity, They may have higher levels of asthma, arthritis, kidney problems, depression, hypertension. It's a real issue. And there's some evidence, too, that food insecurity for some people may be associated with higher risk kinds of coping strategies, aka substance misuse. There's some studies that talk about that. So if any of you are supervising people on probation or parole with a substance use related issue, has anyone ever looked at could food insecurity be one variable of many? Children who grew up in a home where one or both caregivers was incarcerated, so looking at parental incarceration literature, couple studies have actually looked at food insecurity being higher among kids that have had one or both parents incarcerated. And what happens if that child was dealing with food insecurity throughout a long period of time during critical stages of development? Some evidence has also shown that for adolescents that have a long history of food insecurity, they may have higher levels of low self-control that eventually may bring them into contact with the criminal justice system. So a lot of things to think about. Joe, before I move into screening and intervention, any thoughts? I mean, we could go a lot deeper into this, but I know we're probably running out of time.
I made a note of that terminology around food insecurity, Jerrod, because as you were speaking, I was thinking about all of the implications that phenomenon would have for a justice-involved individual. As you know, I do a lot of work around various risk need assessments, and I'm always preaching that we need to look at the holistic snapshot of a client. And I'm just wondering if we need to start incorporating questions around food insecurity, because those tentacles just reach so many aspects of the client's life and behavior.
It does. I'll share some screening and intervention, and I'd love to come back to that and see if what I share answers that question. And when we're looking at a screening lens, could excessive sugar consumption be a self-medicating pattern of behavior for some individuals? Maybe. What are some other self-medicating patterns of behaviors you want to be on the lookout for? Drug use, alcohol use, tobacco use. Could it be a fast food addiction? There is literature out there that talks about fast food addiction. Is that a real thing? It's debatable, but it sure appears on the surface. Caffeine, is someone abusing caffeine? Those are some things that could be self-medicating patterns of behavior to be on the lookout for. When I give talks on the behavioral health side of things through a health and wellness lens, I always ask the audience to consider 3 questions. And this is just as applicable for the clients you serve as well as you as the professional. Are you thriving in your life? Or are you just maintaining? Or are you regressing? It's just some good open-ended questions to consider. Now, how are we thriving? Now, some people say, well, I'm thriving and making lots of money and I have a great job. But are you sleeping well? Have you put on 20 pounds this past year? Are you never exercising? You have aches and pains. Your digestive health is terrible. You're eating a terrible diet. Looking at it holistically, I'm a big fan of. I think when we talk about these topics too, through just a general well-being lens, some basic things to consider. What's the client's level of self-esteem like? Is there lower levels of self-esteem at play? Do they struggle with optimism? So maybe they have a hard time having an optimistic view of the future and they always think things are just terrible. And I've heard this anecdotally from cases I've consulted on. If the client thinks life's terrible and there's nothing to look forward to, who cares about what I eat? What do I do? I'll just lay around and eat terrible food. I'll drink sodas all day long. I'm on the screen all the time. I never exercise. I never go to the doctor. I don't go to the dentist, those kind of things. What's their overall self-concept like too? Self-belief. Do they have good self-control? Without good self-control and self-regulation and lower levels of inhibition and having high levels of impulse control issues have absolutely been studied within this context. And some people that have lower levels of self-control may have a problematic relationship with food in some cases where they overeat constantly. They may have a very poor sleeping pattern where they choose watching movies all night over getting a good night's sleep. So then the next day they're exhausted and they call in sick to work. What is their financial spending habits like? People with low levels of self-control, do they have a tendency to blow through all their money really quickly? And they're buying things they don't need, and now they don't have enough money for their rent. All of these things are problematic, especially if someone's on probation and parole and they're required to find a job, keep a job, maintain an apartment. Driving habits, low levels of self-control may be a factor in more driving aggression, self-regulation of just controlling their emotions. Those things are just something to be aware of. If you ever have clients that have blood sugar instability, and most people do in the United States, according to the research, that have some level of blood sugar level dysregulation, the very nature of just skipping a meal or overeating can throw our blood sugar levels too high or too low. Blood sugar instability, sometimes people will have more inattentiveness, so they have a hard time staying focused. They could be more hyperactive, depending on if they're pounding down the sugar-sweetened beverages, processed foods. It can exacerbate irritability and anxiety. So be on the lookout for those kind of things. And I think also we want to be aware of, too, how this is really influenced by trauma. If you go deep into the weeds with the adverse childhood experiences literature, that research talks about, and again, everybody, I think, for the most part, has been impacted by trauma, directly or indirectly, at some point in their life. I'm talking about people that have had extensive traumas, and we work with clients like that. If you're working in the criminal justice system, you know very well that the majority of people in prison have had a lot of traumas in their life. And the very nature of going to prison can be very traumatic for people, and they might sustain more trauma in prison. But higher numbers of traumas in childhood, and if those issues go unaddressed, there is evidence to support, and again, it's not with everyone, but there might be higher levels of obesity. There's been some evidence to support the fact that the person may have higher levels of binge eating problems or food addiction. It's been linked to higher levels of irritable bowel syndrome, more inflammatory issues in our body, more digestive health issues, and overall general dysregulation of our immune system and our endocrine system, aka our guts off, our HPA axis off. A lot of things to think about. So, Joe, I can go longer if you'd like, deeper into the weeds, or if you want to just kind of clarify things. I mean, this was a heavy-duty topic today. We covered a lot. If you are working in any helping profession, especially with clients that have these traumatic histories and drug and alcohol problems, the research does lean to the fact that you're going to probably come into contact with clients on a semi-regular basis who have probably a problematic relationship with consuming too much sugar. Again, it's not going to be everyone by any stretch, but learning about these topics has changed my perception of things, and it's actually changed my own life and how I've tweaked things in my own life. But again, before taking this information and using it in your work, talk to a nutritionist, talk to a medical doctor, seek training, education, consultation, because we really just scratched the surface on some of these topics. These are big, heavy-duty topics that are a lot of times rooted in biochemistry and neuroscience, but it also has application to mental health providers, chemical health providers, and criminal justice providers. And one thing else I would share, Joe, is there is evidence, again, I'm going to highlight just a few things, that some studies have talked about utilizing nutrition-based interventions to reduce antisocial behavior. I know that there's a few studies that have looked at putting juvenile delinquents on a lower sugar diet, and it's actually shown to reduce delinquent behavior within those sample sizes. I don't have time to get into the specifics in those studies, but if your audience has questions, wants links to these articles, I can definitely share them. And with what we're talking about today, I'm really a huge fan of taking a integrative kind of behavioral health approach, a multidisciplinary approach to combating these problems, because we can't do it alone. And if you're a probation officer, give one example. If you're supervising a client on probation, is your client also dealing with mental health issues? Are they trying to stay sober? Are they struggling with memory impairments? Do they not have access to good, healthy food? Just those things tell me maybe it's important for the probation officer to get that client connected to a mental health provider, maybe a housing support specialist or an employment support specialist, a medical doctor, a nutritionist. Maybe they're dealing with chronic pain or sleep issues. Maybe it's a pain doctor. Maybe it's a sleep doctor. Our clients are challenging and they present with complex needs. So we need to match that with a complex, multidisciplinary, integrative approach to helping these clients improve functioning. Because if we do, I truly believe if we can improve their overall health and wellness, maybe that will reduce the likelihood of them coming back into contact with the criminal justice system in the future.
Why don't I put you on the spot here, maybe, Jerrod, to conclude here. And you mentioned individuals seeking more training, which I'm always all about. And obviously, we're not asking criminal justice practitioners to become nutritionists overnight. But maybe let's conclude with 2 or 3 tips that you could give to the practitioner that they could realistically start weaving into their practice, whether that's something like, for example, being aware of the issue of food insecurity and perhaps as part of their informal assessment, doing some probing around a client's food insecurity, things of that nature, things that tomorrow at work, a listener could say, wow, I can at least start doing this to incorporate, as you said, more of this holistic approach, more of this cross-discipline approach to how I supervise my clientele.
Self-regulation training. Focusing on helping clients learn better self-regulation. And just learning better self-regulation, people can make more informed decisions in their life. I think that's one area to consider. Focusing on executive functioning, training, education, coaching. Understand what executive function is. Check out the other podcast Joe and I have done on that. Executive function is going to really help clients improve working memory, cognitive flexibility, inhibition, abstract reasoning. You'd probably be using like coaching, modeling, teaching, role-playing activities. Metacognitive training, I would highly recommend getting some training in that. Metacognition is thinking about thinking and knowing about knowing. Helping people have better metacognition helps people make better decisions, better self-awareness. Huge topic. Focusing on screen time. Maybe you know your client's on that screen 12 hours a day. Maybe there's some interventions to help that client maybe tone it down a little bit and being on the screen less. Maybe it's promoting self-efficacy. You know that client lacks any confidence, any ability in themselves. Maybe they have a lot of learned helplessness, low self-esteem, helping them boost their confidence, helping them gain their skill, improve skills. Focusing on promoting emotional and social intelligence would be highly recommended. For some clients, if they live a sedentary lifestyle, that's just as bad as smoking, some research says. I'm not saying you're going to go out there and develop an intervention for that client to exercise, but if you know that client lays around all the time, having them talk to their medical doctor and maybe a referral to some sort of exercise specialist or some sort of movement class or yoga or heated pool therapy. And when we're doing all of these things, especially in the criminal justice world, motivational interviewing is helpful, strengths-based approaches, trauma-informed care approaches, focusing on improving sleep. These are just basic common sense 101 things that I would recommend. But again, before doing this, get training, education, consultation, and make sure you know the literature on this too. And it's doing it in conjunction with other healthcare providers.
And I think a lot of this too, Jerrod, dovetails nicely with a lot of the current evidence-based practices, core correctional skills that we're doing, for example, just around cognitive behavioral interventions. It could really be just a reframing on a lot of the traditional training that corrections professionals are getting, but slightly being tweaked. For example, you have talked a lot today about self-regulation, low self-regulation. And again, those of you in the risk, need, responsivity world, when we talk about those criminogenic areas, I've talked to James Bonta, for example, who has said, yeah, really, when we approached that model, they used the domain of criminal history as really a proxy for self-regulation. So again, maybe just start reframing when you look at a client's risk need assessment and you see that they're scoring high in criminal history, that really is an indicator of impulsivity and low self-regulation. So it's not necessarily starting from a clean slate, but looking at what we already know and just building upon that. Speaking about trainings and where folks can learn more about all these topics around executive function, metacognition, maybe give a quick shout out to your agency, APHIS, which is a great resource for folks to learn about so many of these things and so much more.
Yeah, we do a lot of we do continuing education trainings for folks working in the human service arena, criminal justice, mental health, and allied fields. And I've been obtaining more certifications and trainings related to a lot of the topics that we're talking about today. So for next year, I'm hoping to continue to offer more trainings in this arena, really through a neurocriminology lens and infusing some of this literature into the work I'm doing. I've been doing a lot of podcasts actually on this topic. And Joe, you're the first place I've done a excessive sugar consumption through a criminal justice lens, but I've been doing more and more podcasts on this topic through a trauma lens, through a special needs population lens. And there's a lot to say about this topic. And I think we can all relate to it on some level. And at least just having general awareness, maybe then we can be in a better position to, at least in the back of our mind, be alert to this and know that maybe it would be beneficial to refer a client to a nutritionist. And maybe seeking out more training, or maybe your agency would benefit from consulting with a nutritionist or looking at it through that lens. Because I do think if we infuse these things into the good work you guys are already doing, it will only enhance. I don't think it's going to make it worse. I think it's only going to enhance the work you're doing.
I will leave the web link for APHIS in the episode description of this program, Jerrod, along with maybe the links to some of the other episodes you and I have done around, as you mentioned, executive functioning, neurocriminology, to make it easier for the listener to connect those dots. Dr. Jerrod Brown, Concordia University, we love having you on the show, and we look forward to your next visit, good sir.
Thank you, Joe, for allowing me to talk with you and your audience again, and please reach out as questions arise.
Okay, we'll see you next time. A huge Criminologist podcast thank you to Dr. Jerrod Brown. I will leave the aforementioned links in the episode description of this program. Please check those out. Back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroupllc.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, program design, implementation, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Merchandise is available. Visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. Click on the Shop tab to get details on how you can secure your Criminologist coffee mug, refrigerator magnet, or pen for the home or office. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us, ask them to subscribe to the podcast, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
I truly believe if we can improve their overall health and wellness, maybe that will reduce the likelihood of them coming back into contact with the criminal justice system.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.